Right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and we are continuing on with our Shroud Wars panel review series, specifically looking at the scientific evidence related to the question of image formation. Can we prove the Shroud's images were formed miraculously or not? And this is going to be Shroud Wars panel review part 16B. So basically, I did a panel review part 16 back in December of 2024, so about 4 months ago, with Mark Guskin, Teddy Pappas, and that ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry. And we were covering the powder rubbing artistic techniques and whether or not those can account for the Shroud images. And we assessed first Luigi Garlascelli's 2010 or 2009 powder rubbing or frottage method and saw that it was an utter failure. Then we turned to Hugh Ferry's updated or modified powder rubbing, or what he calls the Quem Quaeritis hypothesis. And Mark had to leave, but both Teddy Pappas and Hugh Ferry went back and forth, kind of disputing the evidence after Hugh gave a presentation of his case. And in response to that show, I actually got contacted from a lot of people, including pro-Shroud expert Giulio Fanti. And Giulio wasn't happy with the show. So this is what he said. Quote unquote, this is an absolutely non-impartial fight that saw on the side of authenticity persons not very expert on the subject. Specifically, he's referring to the subject of image formation, because Mark and Teddy are indeed experts, as Giulio acknowledges, in different areas. Mark on the history and Teddy on the forensics and the paint evidence. But Giulio continues, quote unquote, are not very expert on the subject of image formation has resulted, from my point of view, anti-scientific, because it has highlighted a scientifically impossible image-forming artistic hypothesis like the one proposed by Hugh Ferry. And he says, for further information, read his scientific article with peer-reviewed referees in Giulio Fanti's paper entitled Hypotheses Regarding the Formation of the Body Image on the Turin Shroud, a Critical Compendium. That was in the Journal of Imaging Science and Technology, Volume 55, Number 6, and it was published December 22nd, 2011. So that's great. So I got in touch with Giulio based on this aspect because I always want to make sure my panel review, I'm doing my best to bring on the world's experts and the best that both sides have to offer. And I made an offer to Giulio at this time that, hey, he's indeed welcome to come on the show and give his response as a proper scientist. What did he make of Hugh's theory? And I wanted to give him the last word. But again, obviously Giulio English is not his first language. And so he wanted to do this in a proper written and scientific format. So originally Giulio offered to me, he's like, hey, I'm working on a peer-reviewed paper. I want to publish my assessment of Hugh Ferry's Quem Quaeritis hypothesis in terms of image formation and publish it in a peer-reviewed journal. But to do this properly and scientifically, I need Hugh's help. So he reached out to Hugh, had me reach out to Hugh and ask him to prepare samples, do scientific experiments, at least 2 or 3, using his method, state in precise written detail what his method was in as much specificity as possible, and then send 2 or 3 samples of Hugh's experimental results to Giulio in person to directly examine with the cloth. So here, this was great. We had, and Hugh agreed to do this. So this was amazing. We have the ultimate Shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry, and one of the ultimate pro-Shroud experts, Giulio Fanti, through me, working together on a scientific experiment and assessment of Hugh's image-forming theory. And Giulio Fanti actually published his results in peer-reviewed literature and that sort of thing. So I was planning to do the follow-up show where I talked about the journal article. Then Hugh was going to write up a blog, which he's done, responding to that paper. And then I was going to let Giulio have the final word. Now, that's taken a few months, and there's been some wrinkles along the lines because, people are busy. Hugh had plays to do, and that delayed him by a couple months. Well, now Giulio's busy. He's got the Shroud conference coming up and some other things he's working on. So things are a little bit complicated, and I can't really do the two shows I had planned, right? The original part 16 with Teddy and Hugh, and then I was going to have my part 16B where I give everything all at once. Giulio's response in the peer review paper, Hugh's response to that, and then finishing off with Giulio's counter response. So unfortunately, things have not gone that simply. And because of that, I'm planning a series. It looks like it's going to be 2 or 3 shows now, probably, as a follow-up to my part 16. So in this show, part 16B, I'm just going to play a clip of Hugh presenting his case, just to remind the audience. So this will be a half-an-hour clip from my part 16 video. Then I'm going to turn, and one of Giulio's requests, he said to do this properly in a scientifically rigorous way. He requested that I just straightforwardly read his peer-reviewed paper on Hugh's method. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to play Hugh giving his take on this, on his method, and then I'm going to read Giulio's paper. I may stop there, and then because on May 2nd, I'm having 2 experts, Dr. Ken Stevenson from STIRP, the credible STIRP scientist there, and also Brian Donald Worrell come on to my show to look at the peer review paper as well as Hugh's response blog and give their assessment of Hugh Ferry's and critique of Hugh Ferry's image forming hypothesis, this Quem Quaeritis hypothesis he proposes, and the results that Hugh actually got experimentally. Then I might do then I'm going to do a third show where I give my own final assessment. So that'll be part 16D, where I give my own final assessment, taking into account Hugh's blog in light of the peer-reviewed paper from Giulio and what the 2 experts say on the panel review, and I will provide my own final overall assessment on Hugh's method overall. So yeah, there's going to be 3 follow-up shows to my part 16 episode, and I'm sorry it has to be done that way, but it's just the way circumstances didn't work out, where I was trying my best to organize it and have all the feedback all at once on a single follow-up show. But yeah, things just didn't work out that way due to, life. With that said, so what is Hugh's method? So in a nutshell, it's a powder rubbing or a paint artistic technique that involves a shallow bas relief. And let me just share my screen for a second. What Hugh Ferry had provided Giulio Fanti for the peer-reviewed process, a shallow bas relief of Jesus' front and back side images. And he would basically put the shroud cloth over top of both sides, right? One at a time, presumably. And then he would, after the cloth was placed over top of the body, then he would get paint, a yellow ochre or red ochre pigment, iron oxide pigment of some kind, and daub it. And you'll see him demonstrate this in the clip. Daub it over the cloth on top of the bas relief to create the images encoded in paint in this iron oxide pigment. Then he would wash the paint off and then iron the shroud out so that we would supposedly get faint diffuse images like we have on the Shroud of Turin today. So that in a nutshell is his method. But yeah, without me saying anything, let's have Hugh present his case in his own words for the next half an hour, just to remind you what was Hugh's take there.
Now, again, like Gala Shelley and like lots of other people, it's impossible to say that I've proved one thing or another. Of course, we haven't proved it. We don't know if the shroud is is how it's in the situation, but the position that it is now is the same as it was when it was first made. We don't really know why it was first made. I think I've demonstrated that it wasn't made as a deliberate relic. It's, as numerous commentators have said, it's the wrong shape, it's the wrong size, it's got pictures on it, and everybody in the Middle Ages who declared that it must be a fake, their main reason for declaring it must be a fake was because it wasn't like anything that was described in the Gospels. And if you wanted to make something that was a fake, then you'd try and make it look like something that was in the Gospels. However, as we can see here, we've got a couple of holy ladies heading towards some angels holding a gigantic piece of cloth. And this gigantic piece of cloth is part of the Quem Quaeritis ceremony, of course, and it was used in the ceremony to wrap up a body which was placed in the Easter sepulchre. This sort of thing would happen in thousands of churches all over France. And in particular, it seems to me that especially the emphasis on the humanity of Christ and specifically the suffering of Christ is a particularly Cistercian thing. So I looked around to see what the number of Cistercian monasteries there were in the area around Liry and Troyes. That Cistercian monasteries are there in abundance. I did hear somebody, bless them, saying, "Oh, I can't think of any monastery that might have had an altar that was 4 meters long." And I just think how incredibly naive. I don't know if you've ever been to any large cathedrals in Europe, but they all have huge altars, which would be just right for holding out a large cloth that you might achieve if you had been to or attended a Quem Quaeritis ceremony. Just a quick review of the images that we find in the Middle Ages of the three ladies arriving at the tomb. In fact, just about the only scenes of the resurrection that we get, because it's quite a long time before the resurrection actually appears as an image in itself. As you can see up in the top left-hand corner, we have the Holy Sepulchre as it is now, photographed today, but it's not very dissimilar from how it was 1,000 years ago. And sure enough, the earliest pictures we have of the three women arriving at the tomb make it look remarkably similar. You see the round cupola on top and the square burial chamber underneath. And then as we move on, we find the angels talking to the three women, and eventually pointing to the shroud, which was used in the ceremony. And then the ladies would take it. Well, actually, there were monks dressed as women would take it to the high altar and show it to all the people, and that's what it says in Latin in the middle. I don't know whether I need to read it out. I'm sure you can come to it. What are you looking for in the sepulchre, you Christ people? The crucified Jesus of Nazareth, oh heavenly person. And he goes, "It's not here." This is the black are the words of the little play. Ite nunciate, go, announce who he has resurrected from the sepulchre. And then in red we have the rubrics, and somewhere along here we can see sed tantum lineae mania posita quibus crux involuta est. There's nothing there except the linen sheet in which the cross was wrapped. And seeing this, they deponent their turibula, they put down their thuribles and incense burners and things like that, and they go back to the main church, and they sumantque linteum and extendant contra clerum ac velute ostendis. They take it out and they show it to all the people, and they sing that the Lord has risen from the sepulchre. And after that, they superponentque the linteum altari, they put the sheet on the altar. And this seems to me what the shroud was probably originally intended for. So we've got all sorts of medieval inks here. So I've got a thing from Gloucester Cathedral Library, and there are, I think, 60 different recipes for making different kinds of stain to stain things with. And I've got the left and the right. I mean, I'll publish these in a blog sooner or later so people can look at them more closely. But we can see to make red water, you take good Brazil wood, and we're mixing it all up with lime, funnily enough, slate lime, and that makes it nice and firm. Here's another one from the British National Archives. How to make hink. Take a gall and copperas. Copperas was iron sulfate, of which there was apparently more about than we have nowadays, perhaps. And gum of each a quarter or half a quarter. Break the gall into 2 or 3. So we're looking at oak galls here, and oak galls might be an important part of this after all. Just recently, I've been looking closer into Joe Assetta's idea that the ink used for making the shroud was oak gall. And the instructions for making that. And of course, more famously, and this is only a page from it, it doesn't have the instructions for making ink. We've got the famous Libro dell'Arte, which contains numerous instructions for how to paint or how to put an image. The painting is very, very minor. How to get an image onto cloth so that it doesn't flake off when you flap it about. Especially useful for things like flags and so on. Now, when we get on to whether the shroud could be a mold, a print of any kind, or a bas relief, or a dabbing, or something like that, I think we do well to look at this, which is from only shortly after the shroud was first displayed, and it is extraordinarily complex, a piece of woodblock print, and shows the sophistication that people were capable of that time. These were not primitive people messing around with slabs of wood. Now, the construction of this is nothing like the shroud at all. It's not a bas relief, but you can see we've got the black panels were different panels from the red panels, and so on. But in my opinion, the shroud was made by wrapping it over something a bit like this, which is not, you'll see, a fully rounded bodily sculpture of the crucified Christ. His nose is not a lot higher than his cheeks, for example. So then obviously this isn't the model for the shroud, but I believe it was something somewhat similar to it. This is the image in Weinhausen, probably in Weinhausen Museum now, but it used to be in Weinhausen Monastery, and it's an image from an Easter sepulchre. And I think that something like this was made with both front and back, as you suggested, so that the elbows coincided in both cases, but it was only perhaps 6 inches thick. It wasn't your full bodily shape of the kind that you might find on a crucifix, which would be a full body shape usually. Now, you might say, well, why? How do they do this? And there are various accounts of what happened on Good Friday, which are awfully clever. Sometimes, especially in Spain, the crucifix had hinges in its arms, and Christ was taken down from the cross on Good Friday, and pins in the arms were taken out, and the arms were folded down across the front of the shroud, across the front of the body, I should say, and then this body was then placed in the Easter sepulchre. In other times, the crucifix was taken down and hidden behind the high altar, and a substitute body with the arms already carved in place was brought out and they wrapped the body in that. Now, I don't think that the person who made the shroud did it as part of a part of that ceremony, but I think that it was certainly inspired by that ceremony in order to produce a shroud that might have ended up looking like the sort of thing that might have been left behind by the dead body of Jesus after he resurrected. And I think that's quite important as well. The shroud was not intended to look as if it was a miracle. The medieval people knew what a miracle was. It was spectacular. There were no mingy miracles. A shroud with a muddy stain on it wouldn't be a very good miracle as far as the public, the congregation of a church. If Christ had produced his face as a miracle, it would have looked like a miracle. It would have been a full three-dimensional color painting, like on the image of Edessa or something like that, possibly with jewels on it as well. They weren't fussy, the medievalists. They thought that if God did a miracle, he did a really good one. So the shroud was designed not to look like a miracle. And the reason for that was that a miraculous shroud would detract from the actual miracle, which was, of course, the miracle of the resurrection itself. And I think we tend to get this a bit confused in modern times. We think, wouldn't it be lovely if the risen Jesus left behind a miraculous kind of photograph of what he'd just done? That wouldn't have meant anything to medieval guys. They didn't have this idea of a photographic record of what had happened. There were vanishingly few records, even photographs, or not photographs at all, but even pictures of things. People didn't do this idea that we've got to take a picture of it so that we can keep a memory of it alive. You didn't come back to take a picture to make a painting of something until much longer after it had happened. Anyway, I'm beside the point. So here's just a couple. This is the earliest surviving woodblock print that we've got, and you can see that it's like the one that I drew on the whiteboard earlier. The raised bits are all carefully carved, and they're all completely at the same level. They're fairly flat, so that if you cover them with ink and you stick a piece of cloth on them, you get the image in the middle there, which is the earliest block that we've got. And we can see that printing, or experimenting with printing, was coming in at about this time. Now, on the right-hand side is something that will truly baffle you all, because it doesn't look a lot like the face of the dead Jesus. And that's because I can't get, I haven't been able to find a bas relief of Jesus, but I have found a bas relief of a bowl of fruit. And that's the best I can do for the time being. It's about life size. That's as you're seeing it on your screen. It's perhaps an inch or so bigger in each direction. And so I put a piece of cloth over it, and then, and this is where life gets interesting, I start dabbing. Now, the thing that I dab with, hold steady, it's only just there. I've just mixed it. Here it is. Oops. Or in medieval terms, we might call it a pouncer. I shall hold it up for you. Can you see? It's all fluffy at one end. It's held down with sticky tape, and I bounce it up and down like that. So first I had to dip it. Now, following actually, I think it was probably Teddy's advice in the first place. I've already done a thing on the visibility of red ochre, so I was looking at the visibility of yellow ochre. So this is mineral yellow ochre. It's from an ochre mine. It's not made out of iron oxide in a factory. It's from some French company, and I've mixed it it's an egg tempera. I've mixed it with water, with egg, and with a bit of vinegar. The point about the vinegar, it has 2 points. Firstly, of course, the vinegar slightly damages the cellulose underneath, but more usefully from the medieval point of view, the vinegar stops the egg from going off. Otherwise, when you come back to your tempera 2 days later, it stinks. It still works, but it's pretty revolting. But the vinegar somehow keeps it fresh. So by dabbing up and down on it, I can produce that image there. And then I turn it upside down, and that is the back of it. In terms of superficiality, it doesn't come through. Now, as we'll discover, in fact, it's quite difficult to make paint come through, but there we go. That says, that thing underneath says superficiality 1 from a textile level. So I think that compares quite well with the image on the Shroud, which also doesn't come through, although we might see that there's little bits and pieces of the blood, certainly, but otherwise, especially if we enhance it enormously like Giulio, little bits and pieces do come through. Now, how about this? So I took a piece of this stuff and I absolutely soaked it. I didn't want it to, I didn't want to cheat by only staining one side of it. So I pumped up and down on my thing like that. And then I got a paintbrush and I painted it so it was thoroughly soaked on both sides. That's a strip of my cloth. And then, as you see, I rolled it up and sealed it with sticky tape. And then I cut it in half. And then I cut a tiny slice out of the middle. And to my delight, I have to say, can you see that the paint, however hard I try, I cannot make it penetrate those fibers?
Well, but
Here, that paint, the fibers are beautifully clear. Yep.
well, it does look there like there are areas where there are much thicker areas of brown.
Yeah. Yes. Because if you look at the from the outside, you can see that. I mean, from the top left-hand side, the top right-hand side, I should say, we can see the threads which, by coincidence, are the the threads that are going around in circles, whereas the brown threads are the threads which are going vertically up and down. But if we look at the close-up of the brown threads, we can see that the reason they appear brown is an illusion of the light. We can see that they are, in fact, completely clear, and that the paint is only seeped into the outside layer of the fibers. And I'm perfectly happy for anybody else to have a go at that, and you'll find something much the same. Now, I have to say that this is the sort of thing that constitutes evidence and has never been tried. Now, I can quite imagine, because people don't want to chop up bits of the Shroud, but it's never been tried by anything else. All right, this is the 3D version. And I only put it in, and I don't know whether you think this looks more 3D or not. I think the thing about a human face is that the difference between the positive and the negative is so very different. Whereas the difference between a bowl of fruit seen in brown on white compared to blue on black is not very different. But it certainly produces a negative image which is commensurate with what we see on the Shroud. That's the Shroud itself, just as a comparison of it, because the real thing is that we see the face, because we know what a face looks like in a great deal. Our minds tell us that that's a face better on the right than on the left.
Oh.
This is the 3D version, and I think we'll see here a similar sort of thing. Now, just have a look at the brow above the eyebrows of the man in the Shroud, and we can see that it's not brow shaped at all. There's that splodge in the middle, which of course is caused by the red blood stain, but most of it's completely sunken in. It looks as though perhaps the image was originally made out of tin foil, but the brow bit has been completely flattened. It's not good. Now, similarly, if I look over on the side to my bowl of fruit, the apple seems to have a big dent at the top end of it, near where the stalk is, and that dent is not really there. It's only because that's a place where the ink was not applied quite so seriously as it was elsewhere. But apart from that, I think we can see that the leaf is The leaves are fairly clearly delineated, and the bunch of grapes look quite round. There's a lot missed out, but then there's a lot missed out in the shroud as well. Now, this is an experiment deliberately made by putting too much pigment on. Now I'm going to go on to this. I don't want pigment. Pigment is not involved in my ultimate hypothesis, but we start with pigment. Now, I don't know if you've seen photographs of the sticky tape slides, but they all look like the ones in the middle. In other words, it would be hard put to say whether the sticky tape had been applied that way or sideways or at right angles or any way. It's done nothing except pick up random surface debris. Now, Max Fry-Sulzer's tapes, if you push down on the shroud, you pick up a very good image of it. Now, you don't have to do it in yellow like I've done it. You can do it with nothing, with a completely clear tape. But you still, if you rub it in quickly and you rub it in hard and you pick it up, you get an image of the fiber, of the fabric. And we don't find that with the shroud tapes, which has rather depressed me in the sense that I don't feel that they were really indicative of the substrate that they were taken from at all. Nevertheless, here we go. This is some of the tapes that were taken, and these are the ones that Nitowski and Kolbeck got access to, and we can see that quite curiously, and again, this was another serious failing on, I mean, you have to attribute it to Ray Rogers, is that he didn't have enough control samples. He did went for a few, but some of them didn't actually take. And the number of pure image slides was vanishingly small. They were obsessed by blood, and they took lots and lots of images of blood, but very few pure tape, almost none of the backing tape. I think they took one, and almost none, yes, of the backing tape, backing cloth, and almost none of the cloth which had neither image nor blood nor burn nor anything. So here are some of the sticky tape, the Stirp sticky tape samples as photographed by Eugenia Nitowski and Joseph Kolbeck. And the first thing we notice is how completely covered in particles they are. They're completely covered in the background is completely covered in particles. Even the pieces of fiber, many of them, but not all, many of them are also covered in particles. The bottom one in particular we can see. And now this is, bear in mind, this is from image tape. It's not from blood tapes. There shouldn't be any blood particles here. Whatever is here are image. Now, as it happens, I don't think that there's enough particles left behind to be visible. But the idea that there is no pigment on the shroud is grossly misleading. Every slide is covered in dots of pigment of one kind or another. And as we're seeing through the bottom here, the pigment appears opaque, and therefore it's quite likely to be iron oxide of one kind or another. Now, this is quite fun, because now we go to Giulio's tapes, and he has had this idea that the image, whatever it is, damaged the cell wall, but not the primary cell wall, but not the secondary cell wall. And up here on the top right-hand side, top left-hand side, where the number 2 is, I think is particularly brilliant. You can't predict this kind of thing. He must have just spent hours and hours and hours, like I have done myself, poring over these slides and suddenly come across it. And wow, look at that. And we can see that what appears to be here is that the primary cell wall has split and peeled slightly back, showing the rest of the fiber inside, and it appears to be clearer and more unmarked. And down at the bottom, there seems to be another one there where it's kind of sort of peeled apart, where you get that sort of Y shape, and one bit is peeled off the other. And there's a little bit more at the other two, looking a bit the same. Now, this is how I query anybody's idea of what they mean by uniformity. These are Mark Evans's a single photo, which I've jiggled with in a number of ways, but I haven't added any extra bits of color to one side or another. The whole bit has been treated. If I've done a process to it, I've processed the whole thing. We can see that it's covered in particles. We can see that even, especially if you look at the bottom bit, the color of the image is different. The left-hand side is more yellowy, the right-hand side is more orangery. We can see that individual threads vary in color from place to place, and they vary in intensity from place to place. We can even see that the color appears to go right to the edge of the thread and perhaps disappear off down the sides. And if we look at Giulio Fanti's interpretation of a similar slide, this one from the foot, whereas that one was from the nose, and we can see here that he spots what he calls abrupt terminations of color. The fiber is a color and then it stops being a color. What's more, and I think black is really important, we can see where the color goes deeply into the cracks between the threads, especially right in the middle of the top left-hand picture. The image color there goes deeply inside that little crack. We can see it folding over and disappearing inside. This is not a purely surface phenomenon. And then he mentions continuity of color across threads, which we can see in the green thing, and patches where there is image fiber and non-image fiber, even on the same thread. Oh, this is my version of it after I've washed all the paint off. You can see I'm looking at threads here, and you can see a few particles here and there, but almost all the particles have been washed off. As I say, they then had to be ironed. Now, after we'd ironed them, what have we got left? We've got fibers in which nearly all the paint has disappeared, or we can find fibers where the paint has disappeared, and yet the fibers are of different colors. I've got here just an example of a slightly yellower fiber next to a slightly whiter fiber. And I attribute this to the destructive action, possibly, of the vinegar. Well, that's what I'm hoping it is anyway. Otherwise, I don't really know. Perhaps the fibers turn up with different colors anyway. Here is my version of Giulio's idea that the surface area, that the primary cell wall is affected, but not the interior of the fiber. If you look at the sort of upper middle of the left-hand picture, you can see a kind of fist shape punching through a sleeve of discoloration. And if you look at the right-hand picture, you can see what looks like a little sort of ball pushing its way out through a discolored sleeve. So I've raced through that quite fast. And rather than saying this is how things must have been, what I've done is I've really just shown you a lot of evidence.
And these are photos you've taken of your samples. Where this damage is done.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So that was Hugh's presentation in my Part 16 panel review. Shroud words there, and uninterrupted. And at this point, I want to finish off Part 16B with fulfilling my promise to Giulio, where I'm just going to read word for word. That's what he asked me to do. His peer-reviewed journal assessing Hugh Ferry's experimental results, which Hugh did testing his method and actually sent to Giulio to investigate in person. So what was Giulio's response to Hugh Ferry's method here? This Quem Quaeritis hypothesis in his own words. And yep, so that'll be it for 16B. I'll read through that in a moment. But then there are two other follow-up shows. So on May 2nd, I'm going to be having on experts, Dr. Ken Stevenson and Brian Worrell, assessing Giulio's peer-reviewed paper and Hugh Ferry's blog response to the peer-reviewed paper and giving their assessment on the Quem Quaeritis hypothesis as pro-Shroud experts. And then I'm finally going to do panel review part 16D. So that'll be with the two guests, with Ken and Brian. That'll be part 16C. And then I'm going to finish off with part 16D, which will be my assessment, my own assessment overall, considering everything from Teddy, Mark, Hugh, the blog, the peer-reviewed paper, from Brian, from Ken. And I'm going to put it all together and give my final assessment in that theory. In part 16D, that final show, sometime after May 2nd. And bear in mind, for part 16C, in addition, I've been in touch with Giulio, and he doesn't have time to give that final response. That's why we're having to do these multiple series of shows instead of just the one follow-up show that I had planned. But Giulio did promise me he would try to make time before May 2nd to write up a one-page general summary or critique of Hugh Ferry's blog response to Giulio's peer-reviewed paper that I'm about to read. So obviously Giulio was not impressed with Hugh's blog there, and so he can't give a full response just because of the conference and everything else, but he will give me a one-page response, which I will read out in the panel review part 16C on May 2nd with Ken and Brian. So we'll also get some of Giulio's criticisms of Hugh's response blog. But before we get to any of that, for this show, part 16B, I just want to finish off by reading what was the peer-reviewed paper of Giulio's findings of Hugh's experiments, his in-person scientific investigation, published in a credible peer-reviewed science journal. It was published in the Journal of Medical Case Reports, which is a very high-quality secular medical journal. And I looked it up. This is not predatory publishing. It is open access, but it's an incredibly high-quality journal. The journal maintains a rigorous peer review process to ensure the quality of published case reports. And this is interesting because this journal is specifically interested in publishing case reports. That's unlike most medical journals. This is a specialized expert level peer-reviewed medical literature here that we're talking about, that Giulio got his work published in. Without any further ado, let me share my screen and I will just read word for word Giulio's peer-reviewed paper published in this amazing secular medical journal. All right, let's bring that up. Okay, so hopefully that is now showing up. You can see Medical and Clinical Case Reports Journal here. The title is Turin Shroud, Comprehensive Impossibility for a Work of Art to Explain Those Shroud Images by Giulio Fanti. Just published in 2025 in this journal. So here's the abstract. This study builds upon previous research that has demonstrated the hypothesis suggesting the Turin Shroud, also referred to as the Holy Shroud, is a medieval artistic production to be medically impossible. Medically speaking, impossible. Beyond the medical considerations, the Turin Shroud exhibits a double body image imprint. This phenomenon remains unexplained in its entirety and has not been successfully reproduced in a laboratory setting, even with the most advanced and sophisticated modern techniques. This research extends the critical analysis of this hypothesis, which continues to be widely disseminated in popular media, by examining the technical and procedural challenges that a hypothetical medieval artist would have faced in attempting to produce the observed double body image on the Turin Shroud. This study's primary motivation stems from the author's extensive research on the Turin Shroud, spanning more than 25 years of university-level scientific investigation. Based on this research, the author asserts the authenticity of the Turin Shroud as the body of supporting evidence as the body of supporting evidence is substantial. Well, no, bubkis, duda, nothing, nada, verifiable data has been identified that would suggest otherwise. Following a summary of the medical procedures theoretically required for an artist to produce such an imprint, this study further examines the experimental results too. The even more complex and implausible technical operations that this hypothetical medieval artist would have necessarily needed to undertake to produce the Turin Shroud's double body image, an outcome that remains, even with modern scientific advancements, effectively impossible from a scientific perspective to replicate. So that's the abstract of this incredible peer-reviewed paper Giulio's given. So let's get into the introduction here. And again, I'm saving my own assessment of everything until later shows. In this show, I'm just fulfilling my promise to Giulio, reading word for word his peer-reviewed paper. So let's continue with that. Introduction. A recent study has demonstrated that from a medical perspective, it is virtually impossible for a medieval artist to have produced the bloodstains observed in correspondence with the double body image on the Turin Shroud. And Fanti is referring to his other paper recently published in Forensic Science Today, entitled Rigor Mortis and News Obtained by the Body's Scientific Reconstruction of the Turin Shroud Man, published by Giulio and other incredible experts on the pro-shroud side there, proving the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin from a strictly medical perspective. And again, I'll get into my assessment of that later on, but for this one, I'm not going to be reading this paper, but just know this is the paper that Giulio is talking about in his introduction here. And by the way, all these peer review papers will be posted on my blog. So go to the YouTube video description or the video description on Rumble, wherever you are. Click on that blog and scroll down to the bottom. You'll be able to get these peer-reviewed papers for free. Otherwise, you can search them on Google. They're open access anyways. All right, continuing on. These stains, which exhibit distinct morphological variations, can only be coherently explained by considering the Turin Shroud as having been wrapped around a human body that underwent severe torture and crucifixion in accordance with execution practices of Roman types, as described in the Christian Holy Bible. Moreover, specific characteristics of these bloodstains, such as the absence of smearing, further suggests the presence of a phenomenon that remains, scientifically speaking, unexplained, potentially pointing to a miraculous occurrence. While the prior study focused solely on assessing the feasibility of a medieval artist replicating these medical characteristics, this paper or article expands the scope of the analysis to a broader context, addressing the theoretical possibility of an artist from any historical period being capable of producing the observable features of the Turin Shroud. Pope Julius II officially approved the Mass and office of the Turin Shroud in 1506 because he considered the Turin Shroud to be the burial cloth that enwrapped the body of Jesus Christ following his crucifixion approximately 2,000 years ago. Furthermore, due to its contact with the blood of Christ, Pope Julius II asserted that the Turin Shroud should not only be venerated, but also revered as an object of adoration. Again, Giulio Fanti is a Roman Catholic. I, as a Bible-believing Protestant, strongly disagree with venerating or worshiping relics and stuff like that. So just beware of the sin of idolatry and getting into those debates. But again, this is just me reading Giulio's words, and Giulio is a Roman Catholic, so that's why he's got this here. Continuing on, Giulio says, quote unquote, recent analyses of blood samples collected from the Turin Shroud have provided novel insights into the physiological state of Jesus Christ during his passion, crucifixion, and entombment described in the Christian Holy Bible. One of the key conclusions emerging from this research is the hypothesis concerning the mode of Christ's departure from the Turin Shroud following the estimated 30 to 40 hours post-mortem after his death. That's when Jesus rose from the dead supernaturally between 30 and 40 hours after he had died on the cross. Okay, Giulio goes on, quote unquote, the study proposes a novel interpretation based on the concept of material transparency, demonstrating that Jesus' body came out of the Turin shroud in a way that did not touch the integrity of the cloth. See figure 1. And he's got figure 1, which is the shroud image here, the upper frontal image of the Turin shroud, taken by Gisby Andre in 1931. And it's been digitally remastered. Now, the Turin shroud remains an unparalleled object of study at the very intersection of modern academic disciplines like archaeology, engineering, forensic science, and theology. The Turin shroud is a handcrafted linen textile woven in a 3-to-1 herringbone twill pattern, measuring approximately 4.4 meters, or 14.4 feet in length, and 1.1 meters, aka 3.6 feet, in width. The cloth bears 2 full-length frontal and dorsal or backside images of a human figure inexplicably impressed upon the fabric. Recent analyses of blood samples collected from the Turin shroud have provided novel insights into the physiological state of Jesus Christ during his passion, crucifixion, and entombment. After examining the innumerable scientific and historical data, the author, Giulio Fanti, is convinced that the Turin shroud is indeed the authentic shroud of Jesus Christ. Historical analyses provide further indications of the Turin shroud's antiquity and authenticity. Numismatic studies have identified clear correspondence between the facial image on the Turin shroud and artistic depictions of Christ on Byzantine coins dating from the 7th century AD onward. After disappearing following the sack of Constantinople in 1204, the relic known as the Shroud of Christ re-emerged in Europe in 1353 in Liry, France. Historical records made the beginning of its well-documented presence in Western Europe. And again, so Giulio is advancing the image of Edessa hypothesis, where it disappeared during the Crusade. Other pro-shroud historians like Jack Markward and myself would disagree and say, no, it hung into was still there in Constantinople till 1261, and then it came to Europe. But again, this is Giulio Fanti's views, and I'm just reading word for word what his paper says. So forget about those disputes, but just be aware of that on your end. Okay, continuing on, Giulio says, in 1532, while housed in the Sainte-Chapelle of Chambéry, France, the Turin shroud sustained damage in a fire evident on the cloth still today. In 1578, the Turin shroud was transferred to Turin, Italy, where it has since been preserved except for brief periods during times of wars. In 1988, radiocarbon dating of the Turin shroud yielded an erroneous date range of 1260 to 1390 AD. This result remains a subject of ongoing debate, with multiple studies challenging its reliability due to very probable contamination, especially caused by environmental factors. Recent findings, including the detection of beta radioactivity and fluorescence in the bloodstains on the Turin shroud, further confirm the inaccuracy of the 1988 radiocarbon dating results. These discoveries suggest that neutron reactions, radiation, just like Bob Rucker says, related to the body image formation, may have skewed the radiocarbon measurements. Presence of selective radioactivity detected in the Turin shroud strongly indicates that the 1988 radiocarbon dating results are biased by an intense neutron flux that altered the isotopic composition of the linen fibers, leading to a younger, apparent radiocarbon age. Such a neutron flux could be easily associated with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, before addressing the currently insurmountable issue of the formation of the quote-unquote impossible body image, an aspect that will be discussed in detail later. This article first synthetically examines the physical condition of Jesus Christ, as inferred from forensic analysis of the Turin Shroud. It also synthesizes the extremely complex and medically implausible procedures that Hugh Ferry's hypothetical medieval artist would have had to execute to replicate the highly specific and anatomically accurate details observed on the Turin Shroud man. Authenticity of the Turin Shroud is often understood to mean different concepts that are discussed in the first reference, the first paper I showed you about that Giulio in Forensic Science Today. Here, the intended concept is that the Turin Shroud wrapped the body of Jesus Christ, who was severely scourged, crowned with thorns, crucified, and died before being resurrected today on Easter Sunday, 2,000 years ago. It was such perfect timing to be reading this paper. And thinking, all those 2 millennia ago, Jesus rose from the dead. He conquered death and sin. And that can be applied for us so we can be forgiven. It's amazing. But continuing on, Giulio says, quote unquote, his image was transferred to the Turin Shroud through a release of energy during the resurrection, resulting in an indelible double body image that remains visible even after 2 millennia. Reference 1 basing on references 5 and 6. 2 also critically compares the claims in support of the medieval work of art hypothesis for the Turin Shroud, with the strong points in support of authenticity, thus highlighting how weak the art hypothesis is. The scientific literature highlights numerous contributions in favor of the authenticity, also reported in the following references, and he gives a bunch. The author has performed several experiments, wrapping various statues and mannequins with semi-transparent copies, even life-size, of the Turin Shroud, both to study the characteristics of the wrapping of the relic and to determine the type of distortions present with a three-dimensional body. In the body image of the Turin Shroud, caused by the wrapping of a fabric with a three-dimensional body. See figure 2. So here's his experiments right here. Experiments performed by Giulio Fanti, wrapping various statues with semi-transparent copies of the Turin Shroud to study the various resultant body image distortions. Remember, that's talking about, we know with the Shroud of Turin, the body images were vertically encoded, strictly vertical. No lateral distortions. Okay, so Giulio goes on. In fact, details of distortions emerged, especially in reference to the chest and legs, that no artist would have thought of reproducing if he had not conducted experiments in wrapping three-dimensional human bodies. Highly implausible that some medieval or earlier artist would do such a thing, or even later. Dead bodies, ick, yuck, you're not supposed to touch those. Even going back to the ancient Roman Empire with the pagans, they wouldn't be so gross as to experiment with bodies and stuff like that. I think of Galen. My gosh, he had to go to Egypt, primitive barbarian Egypt, to experiment on dead bodies and find out that the brain is actually as Galen put it, the king of our senses and stuff like that. That was not common knowledge. Everybody else was so dumb they thought it was the heart that was our brain, but actually it's not. And it wasn't think even in Frankenstein. My gosh, up until the 19th century, there were grave robbers who, for medical purposes, would steal bodies from graves. It was highly illegal, highly unethical. So it's unlikely some medieval Christian artist who's a devout Roman Catholic or devout little Christian would dare do these experiments with human bodies just to find out what distortions should I put on the shroud, which nobody's going to know about until the 20th century anyways. Yeah, right, skeptics. Anyways, I'm getting into my own commentary here. So back to reading word for word what Giulio says. But just Trying to make it interesting because obviously reading can get boring and stuff. So back to reading. In fact, details of distortions emerged, especially in reference to the chest and legs, that no artist would have thought of reproducing if he had not conducted experiments in wrapping three-dimensional human bodies. It was impossible for an artist to impress all those characteristics of the blood, including microcytes, creatinine, radioactivity, fluorescence, etc. You name it. These were all extremely particular, even at a microscopic level, when in the Middle Ages, the microscope wasn't even invented. Like the microscope came in 1590. So why did this medieval artist that Hugh Ferry posits do this? They wouldn't. Next section, medical notes on the physical status of Jesus. We believe it is useful to synthetically consider the particular state of Jesus wrapped in the Turin shroud before proceeding to the analysis of the formation of the body images. The following references confirm the presence of blood consistent with the typical torture wounds suffered by Jesus. In particular, reference 3, in addition to the unusual reddish color of type A blood, notes that this blood is mixed with earthy material typical of Jerusalem and is composed of microcytes measuring between 0.3 and 2 micrometers. It therefore confirms the severe uremia due to the flagellation of the kidneys that Jesus suffered, and the consequent difficulty in exchanging oxygen, which caused extremely labored breathing. Creatinine particles from 50 to 200 nanometers, or micrometers, I'm not sure what that means, nm, found in this blood confirmed the atrocious torture suffered by Jesus, also described in the CHB. References 1 and 4 therefore reconstruct the sequence of events and pathologies that led to the painful death of Jesus on the cross, culminating in a heart attack followed by hemopericardium. The heart disease, known as Quem Quaeritis in Italian, caused by psychological stress, began at the Last Supper, as mentioned in the Gospel of John chapter 13, verses 1 to 3, and was accentuated in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus manifested hematidrosis, as Luke chapter 22, verse 44, in other words, bloody sweat. He was then severely beat and subjected to a heavy flagellation that caused severe hypovolemia with significant traumatic insult to the heart. The heavy cross accentuated the congestive heart failure, worsening the cardiovascular dysfunction, renal failure causing microcytic anemia with consequent tachycardia, and coagulopathy caused by blood loss, hypovolemic shock, and severe hydration. See John chapter 19, verse 28. All further burdened the heart. The cardiac lesions then also increase the following generated tonic and clonic contractions. Congestive heart failure, accentuated by the spiritual agonies suffered by Jesus for the insults received, increased the stress that caused a pericardial effusion with consequent hemopericardium, not to be confused with Takotsubo pathology. No idea what that is. Sometimes assumed as the cause of death. Incidentally, death by hemopericardium associated with severe chest pain is consistent with the loud cry that Jesus uttered shortly before dying. Now, after death, the body of Jesus is in evident rigor mortis, consistent with the position assumed on the cross, and was wrapped in the Turin shroud. Analyses showed that the body remained wrapped in the Turin shroud for only 30 to 40 hours at most, because there were no signs of putrefaction on the cloth. The lack of smearing in the bloodstains transferred in the liquid state demonstrates that the body was not tampered with or moved during this time. Combining these facts, it can be deduced that the body of Jesus passed through the Turin Shroud without materially compromising it. The perfect congruence between the Christian Holy Bible, which extensively mentions the resurrection of Christ, suggests that an intense form of light energy made the human body transparent to matter. Extending this hypothesis, one can similarly explain how the baby Jesus came out of the womb of the mother, according to the Roman Catholic Marian dogma of the Virgin before, during, and after the birth, which I would just say, as a Bible-believing Protestant, is not a true doctrine. So I just have to be true to my beliefs. But again, this is it. I'm reading the words of Giulio Fanti, and he is a Roman Catholic, so he believes in the Marian dogma. Next section, medical impossibility for a work of art based on the blood evidence. In addition, Giulio says, to solving the problem of the impression of the undeniable body image on the linen fabric that will be considered later to obtain the result that we observed on the Turin Shroud, we must summarize the medical conditions reported in reference 1. Again, this paper here will be on the blog. Necessary to obtain the particular blood stains that we see on the shroud. From the Turin Shroud, we know that it wrapped a corpse that released particular blood stains. To obtain such a result, a hypothetical medieval artist would have had to have performed the following very complicated and frankly illogical explanation operations. So this hypothetical medieval artist that skeptics like Hugh Ferry posit, aided by various accomplices, would have had to murder a person after having severely tortured him with flagrums and a crown of thorns, since he would not have been able to obtain the perfect results seen on the Turin Shroud at the first tentative. The hypothetical artist would have had to perform various preliminary experiments, becoming therefore a multiple murderer torturer, a serial killing savage, in other words. No assessment from me, but yeah, we'll get to that in further shows. So, okay, yeah, look, if in order to get the Giulio saying, yeah, you would have to experiment and kill people or use corpses to get these distortions correct on your final Shroud of Turin artistic image. But Giulio keeps going on. With heavy torture, this hypothetical artist would have had to seriously compromise the kidneys that would not have filtered the urea. This, released into the blood, would have had to make the red blood cells microcytes, with consequent serious breathing difficulties and tachycardia due to reduction of oxygen exchange. Then this hypothetical medieval artist would have had to nail the victim to a cross, causing death by hemopericardial tamponade. In the next time of less than 40 hours, this hypothetical medieval artist would have to wrap the victim in a radioactive burial shroud and then not move the corpse from its initial position for several hours to allow its wounds to drip more blood onto the linen cloth. Incredible. Okay, so that's what Giulio objects to based on the bloodstains. Yeah, and I'll give my assessment, but there's one thing about the Giulio talks about, the off-image bloodstains, which clearly wrapped a three-dimensional, not a bas-relief kind of thing, but a three-dimensional head, where we get side bloodstains from the sides of Jesus' face and head and stuff like that Dr. Gil Lavoie and other worldwide medical experts have proven to be on the shroud, and even Hugh Ferry admits are there. Why would an artist paint off-image bloodstains that precisely match a three-dimensional head? How could they do that? Impossible. But why would they do that? Impossible. Nobody would ever think to do that in the medieval period. And they certainly wouldn't get those results using a bas-relief, right? Because bas-relief doesn't have the full three-dimensionality of the head to put those bloodstains on for... Anyways, enough of my commentary. I'll get into my assessment when I get to the end, and I've considered all the evidence and stuff like that. And like I said, we're just reading Giulio's peer-reviewed paper here based on his direct examination of Hugh Ferry's experimental results. Okay, so the next section is the body image features of the Turin Shroud. Okay, so to understand the extreme difficulty for a hypothetical medieval artist to reproduce the body image of a Turin Shroud, one must first remember the following very particular characteristics that even today do not seem possible to produce together. And it's important to note, I keep saying hypothetical medieval artist. That's not in his paper. He just has HA for hypothetical artist. And I'm just going to call it the hypothetical artist from now on because Giulio does specify. If you remember, I read this. He's not just ruling out a medieval artist. He's ruling out an artist from any period of time. Back in time, before the medieval ages, and even after up to today. A hypothetical artist, impossible, cannot reproduce the Shroud. And that's what Giulio's arguing here. So I'll just be more accurate with that. But Giulio goes on, among the various particular features of the Turin Shroud body image, also reported in those following references, the author, Giulio Fanti, believes that the evidence noted below, taken from Table 1 of Reference 12, where the number CN is here indicated in brackets, are sufficient to demonstrate the practical impossibility for a hypothetical artist to reproduce the image. And he lists out the evidence here. So evidence at a macroscopic level. The first one is E1. Evidence number 1. The body image has the normal tones of light and dark reversed, so the body parts nearer the cloth are darker. This fact leads us to state that the body image appears as a photographic negative. Evidence number 2. The luminance distribution of both front and back images can be correlated to the clearances between the three-dimensional surface of the body and a covering cloth. This is why the Turin Shroud is a three-dimensional image. Evidence number 3. Image distortions of hands, calves, and torso correspond to the wrapping of a man in a sheet. Therefore, considering reference 1, the Turin Shroud wrapped a dead human body, not a shallow bas-relief. Evidence number 4. Some bloodstains also appear outside the body image. Okay, great. So he gets to that now. That's what I was telling you about before. Evidence number 5. The body image has a high resolution of 4.9 plus or minus 0.5 millimeters, but no well-defined contours. It has that image diffuseness that I call it. There's no borders around the body images. This means the body image seems to disappear if one looks at it from a distance closer than about 1 meter. Finally, evidence number 6. The front image, at least near parts of the head, is doubly superficial. This means that the 0.34 millimeter thick fabric presents a superficial image on one side of about 0.03 millimeters thick, no image in the middle, and another superficial image on the other side. So that's what I call the double superficiality feature. Again, as fans of mine will know, I don't include this as a minimal relevant feature, but Giulio Fanti does. So he's using this as a proven fact to assess Hugh's theory. Then he gets into his final category of evidence, evidence at the microscopic level, because figure 3 shows a reference to the non-image sample of the Turin Shroud. So this is where there's no image at a microscopic level. So you can use that to compare to the others. So evidence number 7, the coloration does not appear under the threads where they cross in the weave of the cloth. Evidence number 8, the images are adjacent to non-yellowed fiber striations are evident. And he says figure 4 illustrates this right here about the striations. You can see figure 4 striations of the image threads on the top. Detail of the Turin Shroud eye. This is a photo by Mark Evans and of Barry Schwartz, where also a crevice appears on the bottom for comparison striations obtained with corona discharge experiments. So interesting. Okay. Evidence number 9. The image color is frequently concentrated in the crevices, talking about the body image here, where 2 or more threads cross each other. And apparently figure 5 below shows that. Evidence number 10. There is no cementation between fibers or signs of capillary flow in the body image areas. Evidence number 11. The linen fibers of the image lie only on the uppermost portions of the threads, leaving the inner fibers uncolored. Finally, E12, the last evidence Giulio's using. The fibers are uniformly colored around their cylindrical surface. So this is what I call cylindrical uniformity. Again, I don't use this as a minimal relevant feature myself in my work back in 2018, but Giulio considers it established and he uses it. And he says the color is not concentrated in spots as we could expect from a pigmented fiber. In reference to evidence 4, reference number 3, or figure 6.2, has further highlighted the fact that scourge wounds appear outside the body image around the shoulder, thus showing the clear contrast between an extremely intelligent and murderous hypothetical artist, human artist, who would have obtained an image that is still not reproducible today, and at the same time a hypothetical artist who instead made a big mistake in tracing the bloodstains on the outside of the human bodies that they killed and used. Okay, the next section in the paper on page 5, hypotheses formulated to explain the Turin Shroud's body image. After Secondo Pia published the first photograph of the Turin Shroud in 1898, countless image-forming hypotheses were formulated on the formation of the body image without managing a complete explanation. The most interesting ones reported in reference 12 are synthesized below. So the first, Paul Vignon, in 1898, hypothesized that the image resulted from direct contact, with a living body smeared with chalk. I'm not chalk, okay. I haven't heard that. That's interesting. But yeah, I've heard the direct contact, he's smeared in sweat and alloy and myrrh and stuff like that. But okay, maybe Paul Vignon also posited Jesus' corpse being covered in chalk, or I don't know. Anyways, but in 1900, A. Loth was the first to propose electrical energy as the primary source for forming the image, consisting of lightning. So I didn't know that either. The first, A. Loth posited the first naturalistic electrostatic mechanism. A guy named R. Coulson improved Vignon's hypothesis shortly after, and describing a chalk mold covered with zinc dust placed on a photographic plate, and Vignon in 1902 proposed another hypothesis based on the formation of the image due to the emanation of ammonia vapors produced by a corpse. This is the famous or infamous vaporograph hypothesis, gas diffusion, right? In this case, vapor diffusion, ammonia vapors, produced by a corpse. Several scholars then improved this hypothesis. First of all, Dr. Ray Rogers, who in 2005, at the end of the 20th century, referred to it as the Maillard reaction between amines and sugars. John Volkringer, studying the imprints produced in old herbals by the pressure of leaves, proposed a formation caused by direct body-leaf contact. And remember, the ultimate Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry, in my Shroud Wars panel review, part 17, suggested, well, maybe there's an artistic version of the Volkringer hypothesis that he wanted to look into. That still utterly fails, but Hugh was going to look into that. Other scholars, such as J. Judica Cordiglia, M. Moroni, and S. Sebastiano Rodante, and R. Ramanusi, used sculptures or real human heads soaked in blood, urea, sweat, alloy, and myrrh, and covered with linen or leather to support the contact hypothesis. However, detecting the utter failure of their intent, some researchers, such as M. Alonso, a member of the prestigious Shroud Science Group, proposed mixed mechanisms, combining the hypothesis of gas diffusion and that of direct contact. While until the mid-1900s, several artistic copies were made, declaring their origin as that of O. Vizon toward the end of the 1900s. Anonymous artistic copies were made, trying in vain to demonstrate that a medieval artist could have reproduced the Turin Shroud. Among these, we find Emily Craig, Joe Nickel, Nathan Wilson, and Luigi Garlascelli, who all used pigments or chemical reagents affixed to the linen fabric, and also Delfino Pesce, who used a bas-relief of heated metal, aka the scorch hypothesis. Don't forget Nicholas Allen, who instead proposed a particular protophoto or photographic technique. Basically, a large group of scholars turned their attention to hypotheses based on the emission of particular neutrons, protons, or electronic radiation, either by the human body wrapped in the Turin Shroud, or hypotheses based on the corpse exposed to particular radiative sources. Among these are J.B. Renato, who proposed a double source of protons, which caused the formation of the image, and neutrons, which caused the rejuvenation of the carbon-14 age of the cloth. John Jackson hypothesized a soft ultraviolet burst of energy. G. Baldacchini proposed an excimer laser source. G. DeLiso proposed a piezoelectric source produced by an earthquake acting on quartz rocks connected to emissions of radon gas. Now, after A. Loth, an increasing group of scholars hypothesized that the corona discharge, due to an intense electric field, could explain the image of the Turin Shroud. According to Schuermann and Alan Wanger and Mary Wanger, the body image is due to a source of energy emanating from Jesus during the resurrection. F. Lattarulo and J.B. Giudica Cordiglia instead independently proposed the hypothesis of a human body floating in an intense, natural electric field, perhaps produced by a neutron flux. The author, Giulio Fanti, in this case, has recently revised a previous hypothesis of his, suggesting the formation of the body image in the divine photography hypothesis, which is employing a chemical Maillard reaction based on the contact between sugars and amines, added to the corona discharge hypothesis generated by the holy fire of Jerusalem. This is an Eastern Orthodox phenomenon. The holy fire of Jerusalem is a very particular energetic phenomenon produced by intense electric fields that are repeated annually in the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem for many centuries. This electrical type phenomenon was necessary to reproduce the image of the Turin Shroud. In particular, according to DPH, the Turin Shroud wrapped the body of Jesus Christ when he was laid in the Holy Sepulchre, and an oily mixture of myrrh and aloes was used for the burial in Jerusalem. These substances, also composed of sugars, would have mixed with the post-mortem fluids exuded by the corpse, such as the urea not filtered into the blood by the kidneys, already compromised by the flagellation he received prior to crucifixion. During the resurrection, there was a light, very similar to the holy fire of Jerusalem, but an intense electric field generated a corona discharge. Instantly, the body of Jesus became materially transparent, collapsing the Turin Shroud on the stone of the sepulchre under the force of gravity. The electric field of the holy fire of Jerusalem produced electrons that activated chemical reactions selectively localized on the fibers closest to the human body, and the directionality of the electric field allowed three-dimensional information relative to the human body to be encoded on the Turin Shroud cloth. Over time, the invisible defects produced by the Maillard reaction, activated by the holy fire of Jerusalem energy on the linen fibers, oxidized and dehydrated, thus producing the darkening of the image which is now observed today. From this long list of hypotheses, it emerges just how difficult, if not impossible, it is to try and naturalistically or artistically, or as Giulio says, physically reproduce a body image on linen reflecting all the particular features listed above, and others omitted in this paper for the sake of simplicity. In other words, as we get to the next section, it's impossible, scientifically impossible, to form the body images as a work of art. That's his next section, impossibility for the body image to be a work of art. All right, we've seen above that a work of art based on blood evidence alone is implausible from a strictly medical point of view. But now let's consider the extreme difficulty a hypothetical artist, medieval or otherwise, would have in reproducing the double body image observed on the Turin Shroud independently of the medical difficulties already mentioned that would be added to those presented below. The evidence previously listed is divided into two categories: macroscopic type, evidences 1 through 6, and microscopic type, evidences 7 through 12. As regards the macroscopic evidence, it is clear that it is extremely difficult for a hypothetical artist to apply, and above all, useless and contrary to the artistic result that would be obtained. Why would the very intelligent hypothetical artist have reproduced, who previously brilliantly resolved all the medical difficulties reported in reference number 1, an image with the gray tones inverted, evidence 1, that would make the result less easy for the observer to understand? Why would you do that? All medieval artists, Dr. Tom DeWeslow has proven in his video, are highly stylized, they have borders, they're highly visible, nothing like the Shroud of Turin and the medieval art. I believe that PhD agnostic expert over any Shroud skeptic, fundile Shroud skeptic, desperate to disbelieve in the Shroud no matter what. Anyways, but Giulio continues, quote unquote, and why would he have built an image with three-dimensional information? He wouldn't. Evidence number 2. That is not directly interpretable by the observer. No medieval person knew about the three-dimensionality. It was useless. It would only matter if somebody could invent a VP8 image analyzer in 1976. This medieval genius must have been a prophet. No. Anyways, the distortions of the body image, E3, typical of a three-dimensional body wrapping, do not make a credible result, therefore should be avoided. Then, positioning the wounds of a man outside the body image, E4, would be a contradiction typical of an inexperienced artist. The fact that the image does not have well-defined edges, evidence number 5, is not only difficult to obtain artistically, but is also contrary to the result the hypothetical artist wants to obtain. The body image disappears to an observer at a distance of less than 1 meter. Finally, obtaining a doubly superficial image, evidence number 6, is a truly difficult undertaking for a hypothetical artist who would have had to backlight the linen fabric to superficially reproduce the color on the back of the sheet without having any artistic advantage for the observer. This evidence, considered separately from the rest, really highlights the absurdity of a hypothetical artist working so hard to obtain the results contrary to working on a valuable artistic work. Turning attention to all of evidences 1 through evidence 12, we formulate 2 scenarios based on the hypotheses most frequently presented by scholars without considering the already discussed insurmountable medical aspects. The first refers to the difficulties that a hypothetical painter, as Walter Macroni argued for, would encounter, and the second refers to the exposure of the human body to an intense energy source. What do we have to say about the hypothetical painter? Well, to understand the enormous difficulties that a hypothetical artist might encounter in obtaining a body image similar to the Turin Shroud, let us look at the model in Figure 7. There it is for the body image superficiality with the straws. Drinking straws model to represent macroscopically a Turin shroud linen thread. The color just on the superficial layer of the fibers there. Incredible. Now, Giulio goes on. If we ideally extract a thread of the Turin shroud body image whose diameter is about 0.25 millimeters, or 0.0098 inches, and magnify it about 300 times, we can think of it as being similar to a bundle of drinking straws. Each straw is a flax fiber with a diameter of about 0.015 millimeters, or 0.00059 inches, less than the diameter of a human hair. Incredible, folks. On one side of the bundle, on its top, we see a dozen colored straws next to uncolored straws. Using a simple painting technique, let us think of the operations required for a hypothetical artist to reproduce the evidences 1 through 12 of the Turin shroud listed above on a common linen cloth. First, the hypothetical artist must dip the brush not in the color, because there are no pigments on the threads, but in an acid that can chemically stain the linen. However, the hypothetical artist must see what he's painting, so the acid, usually transparent, must be colored beforehand, even if he must eliminate every trace of that pigment once the work is finished, because there is no colorant on the Turin shroud. Since colored fibers are next to the uncolored ones, the brush must have a single bristle with a diameter no greater than that of a single linen fiber. However, the hypothetical artist must also color the underlying part of the fiber without coloring the adjacent fibers, since the color is uniformly distributed around the circumference of the single image fibers. That's the cylindrical uniformity feature that I don't count as a minimal relevant feature, but Giulio is counting against this as a fact and using it to evaluate theories. Giulio continues, finally, the hypothetical artist should paint individually in this way the several million image fibers of the Turin shroud, thus using a microscope not existing in the Middle Ages, but simultaneously through a mirror and lenses system, observing the body image from at least 1 meter away, corresponding to 300 meters or 984 feet away in the drinking straws model. Because when we approach the Turin shroud, the body image completely disappears from view. If these difficulties seem insoluble today, they seem impossible for a hypothetical, albeit brilliant, medieval hypothetical artist or forger. Hypothetical radiation source. Several experiments have been performed subjecting 3D bodies to different energy sources, but many results have been quite disappointing. Perhaps the best result is the one discussed in reference 17, see figure 3 of that paper, and described above as the DPH. The effect of intense electric fields, or corona discharge, produced a whole body image, where all the characteristics considered at the microscopic level have been verified. Boom, supernatural, Elwary. However, at the macroscopic level, several improvements are still necessary. So unless it's a supernatural miracle, it doesn't work, this corona discharge. And we did that in my panel review evaluating this thing, and even Giulio Fanti now admits the corona discharge by itself is not good enough. You need a supernatural component here. That's why he has his divine photography hypothesis. Let's go on, though. Here's Giulio in his paper, the next section, example showing the impossibility to reproduce the body image. All right, here's where we get into the ultimate shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry, and his Quem Quaeritis hypothesis. Let's get into it. What does Giulio say? Quote unquote, these difficulties in reproducing the characteristics of the Turin shroud still seem insurmountable today, and are, therefore, even more so for a hypothetical, albeit brilliant, medieval hypothetical artist. However, there are still several people in the world who, ignoring, perhaps intentionally, shame, Hugh, sorry, no jokes, ignoring, perhaps intentionally, many of these particular features of the bloody body image of the Turin shroud, who declare through the media that they have succeeded in reproducing the image. Below is a detailed example that, although illogical, easily convinces many people who are not experts on this specific topic. We consider the case of, Dale Glover. Moi. Yours truly, me. Hey, I'm in a peer-reviewed paper, in a science peer-reviewed paper on the Shroud of Turin. That's quite the honor, and I feel quite honored. So, yeah, this is great. I played a role in advancing scientific knowledge on the Shroud. But anyways, Giulio goes on and he says, we considered the case of Dale Glover, host of the podcast Real Seekers, not Real Seeker, Real Seekers with an S, and member of the Shroud Science Group, who was interested in providing the author with the experimental results regarding the hypothesis of image formation formulated by none other than Hugh Ferry, the ultimate Shroud skeptic. You can see him in my Part 16 panel review and a whole bunch of other Shroud Wars podcasts that I've done with him. Basically, he analyzed them in relation to the evidences 1 through 12 of the evidence listed above. So this is what Giulio Fanti found, studying it through that lens. But just before going into detail, Fanti says it should be noted that Hugh Ferry states the Turin Shroud is still little studied today, ignoring the dozens of publications in important journals, first of all, references 7 and 8, and therefore indirectly underestimating, in Giulio Fanti's view, the entire group Shroud of Turin Research Project that in 1978 made very detailed scientific studies on the Turin Shroud in person. No other skeptic's done that, just Stir. To drastically simplify the problem of his Turin Shroud reproduction, Hugh Ferry bypasses all the practically insurmountable problems related to the presence of the very particular types of blood by declaring that the problem associated with the presence of blood on the Turin Shroud is still controversial today. Thereby, Hugh Ferry shows that he does not know the specific characteristics of the Turin Shroud blood in references 1 through 6 and reference 25, which explained the reason for the controversies that occurred almost half a century ago in references 34 and 35. With reference to this last point, the author takes the opportunity to confirm what is reported in reference 3, where the type C blood from the face is preliminarily described. Subsequent analyses confirmed the presence of various red blood cells, erythrocytes, of dimensions slightly smaller than those typical of human blood in correspondence with the face. See figure 8, and here's figure 8 of the blood showing the erythrocyte of type C blood in reference 3, 6 micrometers in size. On the bottom is the spectrum of the elements with the weight percentage. Peaks of chrome are present because the sample was previously metallized. Okay, so that affected the results. Anyways, there's blood on the Shroud. We get that, and even Hugh Ferry admits that. With reference to this last point, the author takes the opportunity to confirm what is reported in reference 3. Okay, so we saw that. Giulio goes on. This result confirms that the type C blood was shed before due to the flagellation. The kidneys ceased functioning, thus producing an accentuated uremia that shrank the erythrocytes. Consequently, it can be thought that these blood cells can be directly correlated to the hematohydrosis manifested by Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Hugh Ferry describes the procedure he used, which is briefly reported below, obtaining the result shown in figure 9. And there's figure 9 there. This is what Hugh Ferry sent. These are his experimental results. Samples 1 and 2 reproducing a 10 by 10 centimeter bas relief of a dragon. And this is what Hugh Ferry sent to Giulio Fanti for in-person scrupulous scientific investigation. So here's how Hugh describes his method for creating these results. 2 experiments used a Turin shroud-like fabric and a brass bas-relief approximately 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. For the paint, 1 egg yolk, 50 centimeters cubed of water, 50 centimeters cubed of malt vinegar, and 0.5 grams of yellow ochre were all mixed into a concoction together. A swab dipped in the paint, then pressed onto the fabric, a swab dipped in the paint, then pressed on to the fabric, resting on the bas-relief, produced the images that we see here. Now, sample 1 was lightly washed to hypothetically remove the surface debris, and sample 2 was washed and scrubbed with a toothbrush to supposedly remove as much pigment as possible. Both samples were then ironed to remove any creases in the cloth. Let us now analyze the 2 results obtained by Hugh Ferry, specifying that if only one evidence among the selected ones, E1 to E12, is not satisfied, we must conclude that these results cannot reproduce the body image of the Turin shroud. So you've got 12 criteria here. Hugh Ferry, they're all necessary criteria for reproducing the shroud. According to Giulio Fanti, that's what he's saying here. You miss even one. Let's say you fulfill all first 11, but you're missing that 12th one. Your theory in the garbage. Fails. Utter failure. That's what Giulio is saying here. You've got to reproduce all 12 of these features. Now, Giulio says, quote unquote, let's consider the 2 results on the front of the evidences on the macroscopic level, evidences 1 through 6. Evidence number 1, reverse tones, in other words, the photonegativity. And evidence number 2, the 3-dimensionality, Giulio Fanti says can be accepted, and he points to figure 10 as proof on that front. Figure 10, the 3D effect of the Hugh Ferry samples reproducing the 10 by 10 bas-relief, shuttle bas-relief. But E3, when it comes to the distortions, these are not easy to determine in a bas-relief. On the bloodstains, well, these are intentionally forgotten about to oversimplify Hugh Ferry's experiment. And again, I'm not going to give an assessment, but Hugh has a response. He says, well, I was just trying to reproduce the body images. The heck with the bloodstains. I wasn't trying to oversimplify it. But I think that is an oversimplification. When I come to my assessment, I'll explain you need to do everything. It's not good enough to do the body images and then, the blood will take care of itself. There's no issue there. They've got to work together. And when I do my assessment in part 16D, and who knows what will happen in part 16C with the Pro Shroud experts on my next panel review, I think we're going to see some problems for Hugh Ferry and his technique here. When you try to put body images and bloodstains together using his technique, I think we're going to see an utter failure emerge. But we're not at the assessment yet. I'm just reading Giulio's take in this peer-reviewed paper. And what Giulio says is that the bloodstains, well, these were intentionally forgotten by Hugh Ferry to oversimplify the experiment. Evidence number 5, the contours. Even if the scale effect must be considered, shows contours that are too accentuated to affirm that an image similar to the Turin shroud has been reproduced. In other words, it has edges, it has borders, very, very accentuated borders. This is an utter failure. The shroud images are diffuse. They don't have borders. You can't even see them from close up. You have to get back before you can even see these things without special equipment. So utter failure. And as we'll see, even Hugh Ferry admits, yep, I sucked. I totally failed this one. Again, we'll come to his blog, response blog. But there is this issue of the scale effect. And so just for right now, okay, Giulio Fanti is saying, look, even if some of this problem may be taken care of, as Hugh argues about the scale effect, even considering that, the contours are still too accentuated. There's still a problem, according to Giulio Fanti, to claim that they're in any way similar to the Turin shroud in terms of reproducing the image diffuseness. Giulio goes on, finally, regarding E6, double superficiality, we find an effect different from that of the Turin shroud. In some areas of the back of the linen fabric, we find some spots consistent with the image on the front side. But these spots do not appear because of a double superficiality. Instead, they appear because the color has been absorbed into the whole thickness of the fabric, thus passing from one side to the other. So an utter failure. It's not even superficial on the fabric level, as beloved Hugh likes. Well, it's easy, right? He takes out a Kleenex and colors in with a pen, says, look, nothing shows up on the other side. Well, Giulio Fanti saying, well, I examined your experimental results, and seems like words are easy, but deeds are much harder. And when we actually look at your experimental results, not superficial, not even on a fabric level. Very interesting, because it says, as Giulio says, quote unquote, the color has been absorbed in the whole thickness of the fabric, thus passing from one side to the other. Very interesting. Evidence number 9, the crevices, utter failure. This fails, according to Giulio Fanti, because, quote unquote, indeed, a position of the color is accentuated in proximity to the protuberances of the thread with respect to the plane of the fabric. This characteristic is also easy to explain because these protuberances are the first to come into contact with the pad impregnated with pigments. Evidence number 10, remember the shroud has no cementation or capillary flow. Well, how does Hugh Ferry fare in his results? Well, Giulio says, although not frequent, contrary to the Turin shroud image, cementation is found above all in the areas of more intense color. It points to figure 11, proving the cementation of Hugh Ferry's results. Utter failure, I would say. Figure 11, yellow ochre pigment on the linen fibers of Hugh Ferry's sample 2. Sample 2 was washed, remember? And scrub-a-dub-dubbed with a toothbrush. And still you get cementation and all this, showing the evident difference with the Turin shroud body images, which are not cemented together at all. Very problematic for Hugh, I would say. Evidence number E12. What happened to E11? Where did that go? I guess, okay, he doesn't have that. E12, uniform coloration, is perhaps the most important way to highlight the complete nonconformity of the proposed method with respect to the characteristics of the Turin shroud fibers, which are uniformly colored without showing pigment traces. Figure 11, similar to what is highlighted in figure 6 on the bottom, demonstrates that all the samples analyzed show that the fabric's color is due to the micrometric particles of yellow ochre used as pigment. So we have to observe the inability of Hugh Ferry to achieve his desired results. In other words, the image color that you see in Hugh Ferry's, it's due to yellow ochre pigment. It's not due to the acid in the vinegar or something like that. Very problematic for Hugh Ferry. His method doesn't work in the way he says it would work in theory. But the experimental results, when he actually carries out his method, they tell a different matter. Science, shroud skeptics, observations, empirical observations, falsify the shroud skeptics, according to Giulio Fanti. Now, I just want to, before I go to the next thing, what is evidence number 11? Why is that skipped over? I just want to remember. All right, E11, the linen fibers of the image lie only on the uppermost portions of the threads, leaving the inner fibers uncolored. So that's thread level and fiber level superficiality, and it's obviously an utter failure because it fails the fabric level superficiality as well. I assume that's why Giulio skips over E11 here. It's just kind of assumed, yeah, if you fail this, if you failed E9 and E10, you've also failed E11. I think that's why Giulio doesn't explicitly state it here. But continuing on with Giulio's paper, quote unquote, finally, it should also be noted that all the linen fabric of 2 samples, 1 and 2, show traces of blackish material near the upper parts of the threads that are totally absent on the Turin shroud linen fabric. Very interesting. What is this blackish material not found on the Shroud of Turin? Sounds like another failure inconsistency, perhaps. Giulio Fanti says, in conclusion, it can be stated that the Hugh Ferry hypothesis, only partial because it completely neglects the bloodstains, completely fails to reproduce the Turin Shroud's body images. In synthesis, at the macroscopic level, E5 is not respected, while at the microscopic level, E11, E8, the striations, and E9 in the crevices are not respected. In addition, E10 is not respected everywhere. However, the most crucial evidence that characterizes the failure of the proposed Hugh Ferry Quem Quaeritis hypothesis is evidence E12, the uniform intensity of color, because particles of yellow ochre used as pigment are evident everywhere. Very interesting. Final section of Giulio's paper, concluding remarks. Let's get into that next. This article integrates a recent publication in which the hypothesis that the Turin Shroud is the result of a work of art produced by a medieval artist or otherwise has been demonstrated to be absurd from a medical perspective. In addition to the medical aspects, one must also consider the double body image that cannot be scientifically explained to date. Therefore, let's consider the sum of the medical difficulties highlighted here in reproducing the double body image. The reader can understand how difficult, if not impossible, impossible, you might say, it is to reproduce an object such as the Turin Shroud, and therefore understand what absurdities are frequently spread by the media when persons interviewed claim, quote-unquote, I reproduced the Turin Shroud. Starting from the recent discoveries regarding the blood of the Turin Shroud reported in reference number 1, right here, posted on my blog for free for you guys, check it out and read it. Also, integrating them with an important confirmation regarding the type C blood preliminarily described in reference 3. And after having ascertained the perfect congruence between what has been scientifically found on the Turin Shroud with what has been reported by this Christian Holy Bible, the immense suffering voluntarily endured by Jesus Christ for us men and women for our salvation have been summarized here. In particular, the tortures suffered by Jesus until his death on the cross are recalled, highlighting the series of pathologies induced by them and explained in detail in reference number 1. Among other things, it is recalled that Jesus of the Turin Shroud was wrapped like a corpse, but remained there for no more than 30 to 40 hours, that he was crowned king of redeeming sorrows with the crown of thorns, and that the microcytes found in the bloodstains highlight the respiratory pathology of his last moments on the cross. After having summarized from a medical perspective how difficult and illogical it is to consider the Turin Shroud as the product of an artist's work, we moved on to analyze 12 particular pieces of evidence typical of the body image imprinted on the Turin Shroud that still make it inexplicable and unreproducible today. The most essential hypotheses of image formation have been considered, highlighting the current impossibility of obtaining the desired results from a scientific, empirical perspective. 2 hypotheses are then described, practically unrealizable from an experimental point of view. They explain how difficult it is to even think of producing a copy of the Turin Shroud that respects all the very particular characteristics highlighted therein. Someone reading the hypotheses described by the author, Giulio Fanti, to try to explain the bloodstains on the Turin Shroud, accused him of having only a lot of fantasy. Now the same reader will accentuate this accusation even more. The author strongly encourages him and anyone who even thinks something like this to propose something easier to realize experimentally, and that allows the achievement of all the desired results herein described. So I have no idea who exactly he's talking about here. Maybe this is something going on in the Shroud Science group, and again, I don't have access to that. I don't know what this is about, but apparently someone was scolding Giulio over his work on the bloodstains, and Giulio is taking this person to task. Well, be more like Hugh Ferry. Act in a scientifically rigorous fashion and act formally like Hugh and Giulio did. They had these established protocols back and forth, and Hugh, in writing and in physical copies of his experimental results, sent that into Giulio for firsthand observational evaluation from a scientific perspective. That's the way to advance and progress the debate. So I think that's what Giulio is advocating for whoever this reader of the paper is, who accused him of having a lot of fantasy. I don't know exactly who that is. And yeah, whatever. Anyways, in conclusion of this discussion, the results provided by Hugh Ferry, who publicly on the podcast Real Seekers, woohoo, shout out to Real Seekers. That's me. That's my show. Uh, sorry, I'm just delighted and proud that I contributed to actual observational science in some way, which isn't really my field. I'm a philosopher by trade, stuff like that. So it's kind of thrilling that I played a role, even if only I was a middleman, something like that, in bringing a Shroud skeptic, Hugh Ferry, and a pro Shroud expert like Giulio Fanti together to advance our scientific knowledge of the Shroud and strengthen the case for this miraculous image. Anyways, so the result provided by Hugh Ferry, who publicly on the podcast Real Seekers claims to have found a procedure to copy the Turin Shroud, is experimentally analyzed, showing instead how far this result is from the actual production of a copy of the most important relic of Christianity. Assuming, but not admitting, that the hypothetical artist had somehow managed to copy, at least in part, the Turin Shroud, the following questions arise. Why would the hypothetical artist have made superhuman efforts to obtain an object that would be only partially understood by scholars of the 21st century? Why on God's green earth would this hypothetical artist want to try to reproduce what he did not know in the Middle Ages, such as radioactivity? The author, Giulio Fanti, concludes and makes his own the following concepts expressed by Theodora, aka Teddy Pappas, the administrator of the Shroud Science Group. Through the evidence of the Turin Shroud, we can help bring other doubters to Christ, who avoid a destiny of suffering in hell. Furthermore, the Turin Shroud provides us with such powerful proof, beyond any reasonable doubt, of the existence of God, that believers can transform their quote-unquote faith in God into certain knowledge of God, which is infinitely better. And that's it for the paper. I will read the acknowledgments of it just to be complete and thorough. So the author, Giulio Fanti, heartily thanks the late Professor Don Lieto Massagnani, who highly encouraged the writing of this paper, and the Holy Spirit. He also thanks all the institutions and scholars mentioned in references 1 and 2, and related papers who provided him with material from the Turin Shroud. Many thanks to Carol Gregorick, a member of SSG, the Shroud Science Group, who, abandoning all her commitments to comply with the urgency posed by the editor, provided very helpful advice and improved the author's English language skills. A heartfelt thanks to Teddy Pappas for the valuable recommendations furnished. The author also thanks, Dale Glover, that's me. All right, I'm going to stop doing that. The author also thanks Dale Glover of Real Seekers for his efforts in providing experimental samples from Hugh Ferry. Ethical statements. As more widely reported in reference 1, the author, Giulio Fanti, belongs to the Christian Roman Catholic religion, and we saw little sprinkles of his Roman Catholic notions and doctrines in this paper and stuff like that. And he's just for ethical statements, he's just stating that, and that I don't think any of his Roman Catholic beliefs means that he's biased or had any impact on the scientific evaluations that he made here. But it sounds like for ethical purposes, he's just wanting to reiterate, hey, I'm a Roman Catholic and I'm unashamed of that fact, and I believe in various Roman Catholic doctrines, whether proven or not. And he goes on, he experienced a profound strengthening of faith through his scientific studies on the Turin Shroud. In terms of funding, this research too was supported by a religious group, reported in reference 1, that entrusted the author, Giulio Fanti, with the analysis of the so-called Padre Pio handkerchief. Interesting, okay. Conflicts of interest, the author declares no conflict of interest at all. So that, and then he gets into the references. So that's it. I've officially read the entire peer-reviewed paper in a credible medical journal by Giulio Fanti, evaluating and critiquing Hugh Ferry's Quem Quaeritis image-forming hypothesis. Incredible. And if you're interested in terms of the history of the Quem Quaeritis, I have a panel review show with Jack Markwart, who just utterly refutes and destroys, I would say, Hugh Ferry's notions on that front, and gives it a very critical evaluation. Yeah, check out, I'll just share my screen quickly. Check out my, so Shroud Wars panel review part 16 with Teddy, Hugh Ferry, that's already up, discussing the Quem Quaeritis hypothesis from a scientific perspective. And also I have another great show called Shroud Wars, Answering the Shroud Skeptics, where for over 4 hours, I brought on Teddy Pappas again to evaluate the scientific evidence of Hugh's Quem Quaeritis hypothesis, and from a historical perspective, Jack Markwart, who goes over the historical aspects of Hugh's theory and hypothesis and refutes it. So yeah, pay attention to those. As I said, in the future, so the next aspect of this will be Shroud Wars panel review part 16C. And that's going to be an actual panel review with pro Shroud experts on May 2nd. It should be up, or May 3rd at the latest, in terms of me posting the recording. That's going to have Dr. Ken Stevenson from STIRP, Brian Donnelly Worrell, and I'm going to read a statement by Giulio Fanti, giving a critical evaluation of the Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry's response to the peer-reviewed paper, because Hugh Ferry wrote a blog. Because Hugh Ferry, the ultimate Shroud skeptic, he has written a blog responding to the peer-reviewed, Giulio Fanti's peer-reviewed paper that I just read to you guys. So let me just show that quickly. Share my screen. So you can see here's Shroud skeptic Dan Porter with his blog. He's wrote the most important article you'll read in 2025 about the Shroud of Turin, and he's praising and blowing smoke up Hugh Ferry and stuff like that, and saying it's the best paper ever. So he likes Hugh Ferry's paper. And here's Hugh's blog. How was it done on medievalshroud.com? How was it done? /how was it done? Where he goes over Giulio's paper and gives his response, detailed response and feedback. And we're going to go over that in the panel review on May 2nd and look at what was Hugh Ferry's blog response, and how do we evaluate that? Did he come up with any successful counters against Giulio Fanti's great work in his peer-reviewed science journal or medical journal paper refuting Hugh's theory from a scientific, empirical, observational science perspective? That's what we'll find out in Shroud Wars panel review part 16C on May 2nd. So tune into that with the experts. And that's what we'll find out in Shroud Wars panel review part 16C with the experts Ken Stevenson and Brian Worrell, and perhaps a statement from Giulio Fanti himself. And then panel review part 16D is where I will come out in a solo show and I will give my own personal assessment and what I think of everything, all things considered, all evidential things considered, because hey, I've got some differences with Hugh, what Hugh says, with what Teddy says, and with what Giulio says. I've got a lot of agreements with Giulio and Teddy, and who knows, I'll probably have some agreements and disagreements with what Ken and Brian have to say on the situation as well. So that'll be panel review part 16D, is where I will give my own final assessment, given all sides, all information, all evidential factors that I've considered to evaluate Hugh's theory, and that'll be the last in this series on the Quem Quaeritis hypothesis. So tune into that, and otherwise, God bless and happy Easter, everybody.